Okay, I had a couple questions. I usually like to get a feel for the level of people's involvement with analytics in the room. So how many people here currently work for a government? Yes, awesome. I wanted to talk to you guys today. And are there any civic hacking types? No? Oh, awesome. So I actually came to work in government out of, I was a brigade member in Philadelphia just last year. In fact, at this conference last year, I was talking to my soon-to-be boss about working for the city of Philadelphia. In open data, actually, I wasn't hired to work on analytics. And when I started, I had inquired if anybody was sort of looking at analytics for the city, and the answer was like, kind of, maybe. And so I asked if it would be okay if I worked on them a little bit. I wanted to see what was going on. I'd recently been interested in the concept of sort of the roll-up account for, that would cover multiple entities that are siloed. It could be like a university or any kind of large organization where there's sort of separation and a lot of autonomy between units. And right about the time I started was December last year. And we were working on some data releases, and I had started trying to figure out a way to get tracking installed in all of these different properties that we have. So of the people that work for government here, how many of you have one single domain that all of your properties reside beneath? Yeah, you were lucky. Pardon me. How many people have non.gov domains that they have to manage as well as a primary.gov? Okay. So I thought I was alone in that challenge in the beginning. Like I said, I've actually never worked in a government job before this. I came from an arts marketing nonprofit background, but I'm actually trained as a musician. And but I did the marketing thing for about 10 years. And when I was in that space, it was, there wasn't a lot of money, so the only choice was to learn the free tools, which at the time was Google Analytics. And I started working with something called Google Tag Manager. Have you ever heard of this? Okay. I'll explain in depth what it is, but that's basically the central piece to this sort of like tracking a large network of separate and disparate domain names. I decided to blow up my slides like at the last minute before this, of course, because I thought that they were sort of too aggressive. So forgive me if I hop back and forth between just some web pages to show you things instead of embedded. I guess I'm going to start with an image because it usually does a better job of making my point. So this is Bob. Can you guess what Bob's trying to do? Bob goes in a loop like this for 3 minutes and then leaves the site. Never does pay his water bill. So this is not a unique problem. I think everybody that's ever tried to manage or curate content for a government site has known the challenge of sort of years of built-up cruft and different vendors acting on different parts of the site. And maybe different departments managing content and nobody looking at the big picture, right? It's not unique to not have one eye over the behavior of your users government-wide. So the city of Philadelphia decided to start hiring in-house developers in an effort to redesign the website. So they brought on a director of civic technology who's sitting in the back. This is Aaron Ogle, also a former CFA fellow of the first class. Also the inaugural class, but that was a terrible joke. And he started hiring a team to support building out Phila.gov from the inside out. Instead of hiring a vendor to do it and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars over many years, they're building it iteratively and in the open under the gov.uk model of sort of going through content and sort of sucking in one department at a time, doing content auditing. We hired a content strategist who is actually speaking tomorrow, Erin Abler, and I don't remember what time she's speaking, but she's definitely somebody to listen to go see. They have a designer, an in-house designer, so we developed a pattern portfolio to make anything we build beyond each use case. Every time we find a new use case, we add to this portfolio. So actually, Carissa Demi, my other colleague, manages that. This sounds like one big sales pitch, but she's speaking this afternoon at 4:30. But all of these things contribute to our ability to sort of move quickly once we start a new department. And I'll get to the other benefit to that later. Right about the same time, I started thinking about this analytics problem and how to sort of grab everything and collect it. There are a few ways to approach that. Some governments actually, in the UK, they sort of have this, they don't use one single Google Analytics profile. They've got a platform that sort of pulls in information from several different analytics tools, and in some cases, departments themselves are uploading performance metrics via even like Excel spreadsheets or things like that. And that all feeds into, they have a government-wide performance dashboard. But we weren't quite that far advanced, and in fact, when I started, we had less than 40% of just phila.gov was covered in monitoring, in any kind of analytics. That doesn't count the other 40-some domain names that we own that were not phila.gov that I found. There was no list when I started. Does everybody, this is partially this is therapy for me too. So, does anybody else have that problem? There was no list, there's no like one person keeping track of all the domains that you own? Yes, yeah. I spent an afternoon on Google looking up all of the domains that like looked anywhere close to officially owned government websites, which is a problem that hopefully I'm thinking will be addressed in the next few years at the federal level, with sort of this compelling people to use .gov domain names as a sign of, an authorized government entity. If you notice at the federal level, often they have the flag at the top of each site that says this is an official site of the US federal government. So I had been sort of trying to deploy tracking as far and as wide as we could, but at the same time, everybody knows what 18F is here, right? Okay, usually have to explain that elsewhere. They started working on it. It was like creeping on their GitHub repo for a federal government-wide analytics dashboard, and it's live at analytics.usa.gov. But let me go back to my slides here. Whoop. So I didn't even show you phila.gov. Oh, we just had the Pope in Philadelphia, in case no one heard about that. So, I mean, there's sort of all kinds of problems that we see, but I mean, how do we measure that? How do we measure what's a problem? How do we figure out what is related to content, and how do we figure out what is related to, maybe something specific to our users in Philadelphia? But you can see at the top, there's a flag at the top that says, we're rebuilding this, we're working on this. If you want to go check out the new thing, you can click here and go and take a peek. So as we go along, we've gotten through, I think, we're working on the second full department. The first one went live in the summer. The idea being that as content is migrated, eventually more and more of the site will be under the alpha template. Excuse me. Pardon me. But anyway, back to 18F. They launched you can see the other one. This website pulls data from the digital analytics program. Is anybody familiar with that? So this is a federal agency. Oh, hi, Eric. It's a federal, I'm sorry about my throat. I've actually, so the Digital Analytics Program is a federal level group that has been deploying basically the same thing that I was trying to do at the local level and hit every federal agency and one roll-up account. It's one Google Analytics account, which was the same model that I was hoping to deploy at the city. And this is basically, it's a Node.js app that just sits on like a virtual machine. And then it puts the data into an Amazon S3 bucket. So it's just a storage area. And then it has a front end that goes and looks at what the data is. So it's very robust under load. It's not actually doing anything except refreshing itself every 15 seconds. This is all open source. 18F built this and the reporting tool that's grabbing the information. They're all available on GitHub to redeploy. So I was looking at this, and I'd never played with Node before. In fact, I just started learning to code this year, but I really wanted it. And I knew that we had the data starting to aggregate in the background. So we forked this and applied our pattern portfolio, right? So that made that process much more rapid. And then we were able to redeploy this about a month after after 18F launched. So this uses our alpha styles, and it's doing the same thing. We had one analytics account that's collecting information. And when we launched it, there was this huge response. Like, I didn't think about, there a lot of local government was, or local government press wrote about it. And then we got feedback from 18F that it was incredibly validating that open source software can work for government, and something could be built once and reused. And also, I had a background in analytics. I had a consulting business, so I actually was able to contribute back to it based on my knowledge of the API, and I had questions about some of the things that, decisions that were made in terms of aggregating the data. And so that was like the first thing for me where I felt like I could actually give back to a technical problem, and it really encouraged sort of further investigation. So this went live in April, and we're still trying to roll out the rest of the tracking for all of the other phila.gov, because every time you go to a new department, right, it's either a new vendor or someone in-house is managing the site, and then I have to get them to stick this snippet of code in there to track it. So that doesn't scale very well when you're talking about, 50, 60 different sites. That's just on our scale. If you're from a larger city, it could be many more. And then what do you do if you want to make a change in the way something is being tracked? So you have to go back to all 56 sites and say, hey, can you change the snippet of code that's in your site that's giving me these analytics? So my answer to that is this product called Google Tag Manager. It's, like I mentioned before, I have a background in marketing. It's a tool that was built for marketers. There is a technique that marketers use to track how their ads are working called conversion tracking. It involves hiding a little invisible pixel on a web page so that when someone clicks on an ad and comes to the page, it sends that conversion off to some other analytics situation that's collecting how many times someone did that. That basically means that you have to put a snippet of code in your web page to track those conversions. And every time you place a new ad or use a new company, you have to swap those out. So this tool was built so that marketers wouldn't have to go to IT every time they wanted to change one line of code in the header of some document on the page to track conversions. It basically it's JavaScript with a UI. So it's a web-based tool. You can log in and manipulate JavaScript on your web page. It does this by taking one snippet of code, and instead of having a Google Analytics snippet on your page, you have the Google Tag Manager snippet. It goes in a slightly different place. It goes in the head not in the head, but in the opening of the body for anybody that has ever managed that kind of stuff. Just so that I don't get too into the weeds, how many people deal with code on a daily basis in this room? Okay, sorry. I just didn't want to be talking about stuff that isn't relevant. So basically, here, I'll show you what the GUI looks like. So this snippet allows us to do other things in addition to tracking Google Analytics. So the way to think of it is a container is what they call these individual items. And you can throw whatever you want in there. It's basically code injection, which sounds scary, except for the fact that it's managed by Google's security. You can log into the account with the same Google OAuth that you use for analytics. So it's one account. It was designed specifically to work with Google Analytics. So the two are sort of, the functionality is very nested. So a lot of the customization you might want to do, like tracking specific events on a page, that's built in to these tags, and you can control it with a click. So this was like the central piece to this formula, I guess is what I'm looking for. And we started to remove the Google Analytics snippet from these sites and swap it out with this tag manager snippet. So let me see if I can find.
So you're saying type manager?
Tag, yeah, G. I'm a little verklempt. So I wanted to show you, if I can get back to my. So this is the web UI that manages basically the deployment of all the tracking on any given web page. So before I get too far into how we're doing this, I want to talk about reasons why, right? So the basic Google Analytics installation gives you a bunch of vanity metrics that they shove right in your face when you log in. How many people think that they are adept at using the reporting interface in Google Analytics? Cool. How many people hate it? It's a pain in the ass. It just wasn't built, I think it's sort of scaled over time, and it's also, I don't know, there's just a lot of orange. That's all I think about when I see think about it. But this model that we're building out is going to give us tools to manage all of those pain points. First is deploying the tracking and keeping it consistent, being able to edit it later, and then being able to do custom tracking. So with this model, this is one container. This is a central fill-duck of tag manager container. From within that, we're sending our Google Analytics data off to the data store. We're also tracking customized events. We're tracking things like PDF downloads. And basically, there are three kinds of content inside a container. There are tags. And this is actually all spelled out in the notes. It's just not pretty right now. But there are tags, and that's the item that's actually doing something on your site. It's either firing JavaScript, or it's tracking, or it's capturing a value and shoving it into something called the data layer, which is established like a hat on top of the container. It's a place where you can store values. It's page specific. It doesn't cross over page reloads. And it's a place to either put things, or you can send from your server data to populate that then Tag Manager can grab onto and either use as a reason to do something else or pass as a value on to analytics. The perfect example of that is like transactional data. So you have server-side like e-commerce transactions. You can like populate that data if you have a user that's logged in to this data layer. And then when the page loads, the container grabs that information and it can send it off to Google Analytics, and keeping your separation between server-side and the client, but still passing that secure information anonymously. So instead of just tracking these sort of basic level page views and sessions and users, we wanted to add context to that to make actionable insights. So instead of just giving, say, my department content managers, well, you know, you had this many people that came to the site this week, enriching that data. And the ways that we do that with Tag Manager, like I said, are tracking things like downloads of PDFs, specific kinds of user interactions. If you wanted to just track all instances of some button that's on the sidebar, you can do that with one tag. It has built-in versioning, so you can build a new, you can build a new tag, you can test it locally, and then only publish it when you're ready. There are some really awesome tools for debugging locally, so you can make a new version. Say I want to fire my Google Analytics tag. I want to track somebody clicked on this button and they downloaded a PDF. I can build all of that out and test it on my local machine in the browser with their debugging tool, called Google Tag Assistant. which I'll show you in a second, and see if see what data is actually being sent off to analytics or to any of your other tracking tools. One of the other appealing things about this is that it actually increases our vendor independence. So yes, we're using a Google tool to deploy this kind of tracking, but we're no longer married to Google Analytics if we want to swap it out. So once this container is installed in all of our sites and all of our pages, if I want to start use Adobe Analytics tomorrow, I just swap the tag out and it's done. I mean, we're not addressing data transfer issues, but there's no need to, obviously you want to make sure that you're following testing protocols and like best practices, but you don't have to deal with like ripping code out of everything. So are there any questions so far? Is anything unclear? Yeah.
I'm interested in crossover with social media.
And tracking?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still like a lot of cities are involved with social media now, but it's really hard to track the traffic back and forth. And I think marketing people have figured it out, but can you speak to that?
When you talk about social media, are you talking about, and obviously it's less likely with government, but paid conversions, like are we talking about advertising on social media, or are we talking about sharing sort of organic?
More organic.
Okay. So you can there's an extra kind of tag that you would send instead of the page view tag, right, which is the core for sending information to Google Analytics. You add a social tag, and you have to specify the activities, right? So the same you would if you've ever messed with this in code. So Facebook, you have to specify, this when they did this, it is a share action. You do the same thing, it's just in the UI. So it's a slightly lower amount of manual coding. But there's like 5 kinds of Google Analytics tags that you send. One is the custom event, one is the page view, social sharing, there's a timing, and then the 5th one is going to escape me because I'm standing in front of people. I'll get a little bit further into that with the next one. So we have tags. We have rules. Rules tell tags when to fire. They can use any kind of criteria. So if I go over here to look at they renamed them. They're called triggers now. Oh, I'm so sorry. So if I want to look at, so if somebody filled out a certain form on my site and I want to track it specifically with some specific information to go with it, I can say anytime someone goes to this URL, you can use regex, you can use campaign parameters, you can use query strings. Anything that you can grab in the DOM can be a trigger. So you can also make sort of like cascading triggers. You can kind of chain these together, and it can get really involved. Bear with me with some of these like nitty-gritty things, so I just want to make sure that what I'm talking about makes sense, because at the end I'm going to give you a full configuration for a standard, like a pretty standard government website. And it's going to do all of these things. It's been vetted. It's the same thing that we have running for the Philadelphia government. And all you will need to do is specify your domain name that you want to track as sort of the umbrella, so your primary. And then the Google Analytics profile numbers, you add them. So those 2 things that I just said you need to customize, that brings us to the last kind of item in here. Those are variables. They're just JavaScript variables, but they call them that across the board. It has built-in variables, so anything you can grab in the DOM. This is where we can get into sending things like all of the JavaScript errors on the entire site to Google Analytics if you wanted to log those. Because the built-in things that it can grab are line numbers of errors and the message. So right now, the city we're sending all of the errors that we're finding to a test account, because I don't want to flood the primary reporting account with that kind of stuff, and I explain why. It's like clicks on anything from an element, whether it's interactive or not, the target, the link, the text that they clicked. And that's important because when we're doing things like tracking PDF downloads, what I can actually do is send that either as a custom event, which means that I can say it happened on this page, and I can give it its own title if I want. But I can also track something like a PDF download as a virtual page view, which gives us the benefit of looking at it in the context of all of the other page views of the site. It doesn't give us magic, like we still can't see what people are doing in PDFs, because it doesn't execute JavaScript. But we can see, that user did these other things before they came to download that PDF. So if, for example, when we track, and we can actually specify with one tag, not just PDFs, but Excel documents or docs or Word docs, anything with an extension that we can be specific to grab. Form elements, so you can decorate all of your forms in the entire site with one blanket tag that says, I want to know when a form is submitted. Because these are all dynamic, you can populate it with the title, the URL of the page, and any other specific content that you want to grab, barring personally identifiable information, in one foul swoop. Now, you may probably don't want to do that in a giant site, but it will all dynamically populate with it.
Going back to PDFs,
Mm-hmm.
you track links that go to a PDF that were clicked on, right? So suppose you have a mailer with a link to a PDF, you can't track it from there.
Did you say a mailer?
Right, so an email.
An email?
Right.
So you can track email conversions. That actually is more closely tied to the social component of tracking. So for marketers, you can track email conversions by installing a pixel in the email itself. That is also possible with Google Analytics. I don't get specific in that because so many governments are not doing any kind of email campaigning that I know of, at least in a really comprehensive way. And it's one of the things that I want most for us, because we can't track any of this like outbound communication. We don't know if that's driving people. We don't know if people are opening it, because there's no global, like, this is the, MailChimp account or whatever for the city. So we don't have that in place yet. Is anybody doing a lot of that emailing? Where are you from?
City of Reno.
Reno? That's awesome. What do you use?
We use Constant Contact.
Mm-hmm.
Same with us.
Constant Contact? Any other Salesforce people around? You do both. And is that like a city or government-wide?
It's departmental.
Yeah. So they choose to sort of opt into it and use it. Is it offered is it an umbrella account that they can choose to use, or each department kind of goes out and buys their own thing?
We're trying to break it down. We're a little in a silo.
Yeah. That's kind of like the procurement problem anyway, everywhere. But so yeah, you can do that. I can't see if they go directly to the PDF from an email. So, but a lot of emailing best practices would actually try to have you bring them back to your website anyway first. Don't put the whole article in the email, put the first paragraph, come back to the site, then I know what you're doing. I know marketers are really creepy, but they don't have to be. And it's actually one of the things I wanted to talk about. This is not cooperating today. So instead of tracking a bunch of information that we don't need, we can focus on what we do. So in this implementation, we have one testing Google Analytics property. And then we have what I call either a reporting or sometimes production property, because you don't want to test a new tag, or you don't want to start sending information to your old faithful analytics profile that you've had for 5 years until you know what it's going to do on the reporting side. You might end up getting a bunch of junk data that you don't want in there. So I always test locally, and then I'll put it into the production website, but the reporting is going to my testing profile first. So this container is configured to do that first. One of the other things that we started noticing was that people are actually interested in knowing how much content is being used from the public. Once we deployed that dashboard, and the really cool thing that's happening at the federal level specifically is marketers and researchers are actually going to analytics.usa.gov to look at things like benchmarking for browser use. Because it's got such wide coverage, it's a pretty good analog for the country. So the prevalence of which version of IE is still in use, and how many people are still on XP. It's close, I'd say. There's certainly going to be some selection bias, obviously, with access to the web, but it's not, for those that are online, it's a decent representation. So when you're deciding how much how far back you want to support for something, you know, new that you're building, how long you want to support. I don't know, what's 9, we're like at 9 now, IE9 that people are trying to get out of. So that tool that we use to report the data to that dashboard is also exposing the raw data in the CSV form and JSON so that people can download them. We actually had a reporter download all that information and sort of do like a little analysis of what people are looking at. So the transparency aspect of this is pretty awesome to me. I make the terrible meta joke, but it's something that we want to make sure that the public understands too, is that we don't want to know who you are, we just want to understand the patterns of the behavior. And this is becoming more and more important as security, as people, you know, all of these major companies are just losing data left and right. The thought of having, you know, the government, which, well, I won't talk about that. Making sure that the user is comfortable with what you're tracking and being open and honest about what you're tracking as well. So no shady marketing stuff is going on. We're not, you know, following you around everywhere you're going. The one thing that is enabled in this is something called advertising features, which basically allows Google in aggregate to understand things about you, but without tracking specific information. So it allows us to enable something called demographic reports in analytics. And if you've ever kind of explored that and seen like, you know, oh, you don't have that enabled in your account, this does that by default, by virtue of being deployed through Google Tag Manager and that being enabled in that setting. So we know things like, in our revenue department, we're looking at how much we can get rid of the umpteen PDFs, right? The data jail. And so we can look at the age of people that are downloading them. So revenue has managed all the tax data. So what we found was, you know, there's this temptation to kind of just get rid of all the PDFs and make everything these awesome wizard forms and, you know, we'll just do everything online. But we looked at the overall demographic of users that were downloading forms, and it skewed 20% older than our baseline for Phil.gov users. And if we just got rid of all these, because they want to file their paper taxes. They want to download the PDF and file it on paper. They're not interested in a web form. Like, they don't care if it's better than the PDF. It's their comfort level. They don't want to do a transaction like that online, where they're worried if, you know, the form doesn't submit, or it spins, or they don't understand what happened, or they don't get a confirmation email. So it was actually sort of counterintuitive, because I know, like, I work in a department of fairly young government workers, and we think that we're going to fix everything with technology, and maybe we don't always fix everything with technology. It was like an eye-opening moment. And then maybe that's intuitive to everyone but me, but I think it was surprising. Checking your gut instincts is why we're trying to make sure that we're looking at actual data. Does anybody do any user testing on the floor, on the ground? Cool. One of the things that's great, so user testing is a tool in the toolkit, analytics is a tool. I like to have friendly arguments with my user testing people about which is more worthwhile, and I think they both have a place. But the problem sometimes with user testing is in person. Sometimes users don't know what they want or what they need, or they don't know the words to say, or the words they use mean something different to you as a specialist or to the, you know, firm that you've hired to do this. When you're looking at analytics, you just see the behavior. You know, nobody has the chance to misrepresent what they were doing or what they thought they were doing. And while on one hand, I think that that's part of the backlash that's coming, that's already here about tracking. It's right on the heels of the advertising backlash. And I think that there's a possibility that in a year or two, like, all JavaScript analytics will no longer be allowed to work, depending on the way this goes. And then I really don't know what we're going to do. I mean, we're going to have to figure something out, because we won't have any information about what users are doing in the client. After that doom and gloom, am I on time? Okay. So that sort of brings us back to Bob and his spinning, trying to pay his water bill problem. So one of the other things that this lets us do is send other kinds of information and fire other kinds of tags out there. Marketers have a toolkit that involves things like tracking behavior, tracking time through funnels, how many times you click, how many interactions they have with you before they come to before you come to their website. Once they do that, how long does it take for you to convert, which either is buy something or sign up for their email list most of the time. And once you find out, there's an extension called Ghostery. Most people know what this is. It tells you, Ghostery, sorry. It tells you exactly how many of these creepy tracking tags are firing on any given web page. And news media is the worst offender, by the way, in my opinion. I once found 44 tags firing on Forbes.com. So have you ever noticed when you go on one of these big, the larger national outlets, suddenly your fan kicks on? Right? That's what it is. There are all these asynchronous tags firing in the background, tracking all the things that you do, and some of them are creepier than others. There's actually, there's a lot of things that are not legal to do in Europe that they are here to track your behavior, local storage and stuff like that. I don't pretend to know all the details of that, but I also know that there are things that even I, as a sort of data mongering, wanting to know everything about the user, will back away from because it just seems too creepy to me. That said, this feature that enables us to track demographics also gives a rough age estimate of the user. None of that is accurate, if you're going to drill down to the one person level, because if mom and dad both use the same computer, then then it's just wrong. And so, but in aggregate, it seems to be when overlaid with other market data that people with large budgets have time to look at, it seems to be fairly close. We already talked about transparency, but benchmarking is another issue, right? So as you're revamping an entire website, how do you judge if something's better or worse for the user? And so benchmarking when we start. So this is why I started trying to roll out this tracking site-wide before we start sucking in more data and converting to the new site. One of the things that I think is interesting is finding ways to involve the user, but without just sort of excluding them from the process, and yet still kind of not have them be aware that you're watching, which is kind of an impossible proposition. But we can do this by adding extra dimensions, custom dimensions to analytics. So of the configuration that we have in production right now, we're adding 4 dimensions that actually let us follow anonymously paths that users are taking through the site. So using Tag Manager, we can generate a random string for each session. We can then connect every hit that is sent to analytics with our custom session. We can then add on top of that, we can pull in the client ID that is assigned when someone comes to your site. It's anonymous, it's a string of numbers. Google assigns it, and depending on how long, does everybody know, do you understand what session expiration is? Okay, just before. The default is usually 30 minutes of inactivity on a site, and it means that you've either abandoned or bounced. So if you've never changed that setting in Google Analytics, it will be set to, after 30 minutes of no interaction, Google ends the session in their calculations. If you were to come back to their website later that day, then it would start over as a new session. So these sort of finer details are why it's difficult sometimes to string together information about one user. So you have one user in one session. And so this configuration is adding that extra information in the tags, and I'll show you. So I tend to number my things, so this is a pretty large installation. Okay. So this is the page view tag in Tag Manager. It's basically a wizard-based UI where these are all the different kinds of tags that could be fired. These are mostly marketing-friendly tags. They're a bunch of things that most governments will never use, or they are ridiculously expensive. But one of the other benefits is you can assign custom HTML tags and custom image tags. Now, images are those tracking pixels that I described before. So if I just wanted to add a Facebook conversion pixel, because I placed ads on Facebook, that's where I would do it. It's one string of code, and it just gives it a 1x1 invisible pixel. This is almost a misnomer because the custom HTML tag can also execute JavaScript. You can put JavaScript in there. And so if I wanted to, for instance, at the city of Philadelphia, we were having a horrendous problem with scraping. And it wasn't just like the annoying kind of scraping, it was our property database, for which there is an API, and it has limits, like these things need to, because we have machines that only have so much capacity. It's specifically our geocoding service, which is this sort of, it's somewhat brittle server, and it sometimes has problems, and some of that is stuff we have to debug in-house. But the scraper was, somebody was using something like Phantom.js. They were scraping on the client side, and they weren't even just going, and they were setting off analytics, which made me pretty angry. It's not a well-behaved bot, it's just rude. It's considered rude. Like, why would you trigger someone's web analytics if you just want the data, right? So we isolated it. It was a bank of AWS machines coming out of Reston, and we still couldn't keep it from reporting extra information. In fact, this started skewing all of my numbers in analytics. It was happening over Memorial Day weekend, and I was just like really upset, because once you start doing that, all of the things that you measure globally, your session length, your bounce rate, everything's gonna get thrown off with this junk traffic that's being fired by a bot more frequently than a human would be visiting pages. All because they wanted to pull down a couple gigabyte, probably gigabyte, database of property data for Philly, which was available through an API and has been for years. They just didn't want to abide by the limits. So what we did was actually create a custom tag. Once we figured out that there was a consistent user agent, it was for a version of Firefox that never existed in production. And it took me a whole weekend to figure that out. And I was annoyed, but we finally figured out, I mean, we can remove that junk data with filters or with segments on the back, after it's processed. But it doesn't change some of the metrics that Google computes automatically. And so it means that our data is less reliable. So Aaron actually, who was sitting in the back earlier, he's a little bit more of a more JavaScript developer than I am. We figured out that all traffic that gets sent to Google Analytics, even if you have a filter on Google Analytics, still counts against your limit for their throttling. So if you've ever had like sampled reports, you're like, oh, this is only including 60% of all the data that was for the time period you requested. That's for Google Analytics free. If you're premium, you get all the things. But does anybody have a Google Analytics premium account? Good, nobody's spending $150,000 on Google Analytics. The feds do, but I can see the case for that. So, where was I? So we figured out we could grab this user agent before the Google Analytics tag was ever fired, because Tag Manager was sitting between analytics and the tag and the data. So once we define the user agent as a variable in our set here, the trigger was if user agent equals this non-existent Firefox client. And we actually were able to just stop the page from loading. So, I mean, we verified pretty thoroughly that this wasn't like legitimate traffic, because all session lengths were 0, and we knew like that there was a bunch of other indicators, because we didn't want to cut off a legitimate user. So once we set up this custom tag, so we used the custom HTML tag to fire this JavaScript snippet that basically stopped it. Oops, sorry. You can also do crazy stuff like track weather. But I'm having a day today. Take my word for it. So the other thing that we're tracking now, which is brand new, I found this script that was written by this woman named Isis. She wrote it for her startup to track frustrated user behavior on page. And it's a really simple, kind of dumb, low-hanging fruit script. Anytime someone clicks more than 5 times on a non-interactive element, within 800 milliseconds, it fires an event. So I can grab that event and then map and send that as a custom event to analytics. And so we have now a custom report that's telling us which pages have the most frustrated behavior. This is a really dumb analog for tracking that. But it's not bad, actually. I mean, why else is a user just like clicking on something that isn't a button and is interactive, it's not a link? They're probably not happy with you. At the very least, it means that we're going to look into what's going on there. And because we can populate this, so that's the actual script that gets executed. This is happening over 2 separate tags. And then we send a separate event off to actually track it, if I can find it, because this is not my day. So there's a separate tag that then just sends off a custom event to Google Analytics. So in the interest of making this slightly less dry, once we've created all this custom data that we're putting into analytics, I mentioned that the UI for reporting is terrible and nobody likes it. So we then need custom reports to get it all out in a meaningful way. Otherwise, we're just kind of like, great, we've thrown all this stuff into the abyss and we don't know where it is. We can't extract it or write custom reports because, you know, if you didn't spend 5 years figuring out the back end of Google Analytics, it's like kind of frustrating. So hopefully this guy will work. There exists something called the Google Analytics Embed API. Have you ever heard of this? It's like one of the secret Google products. Basically, it's bindings from the Google Analytics API, the reporting API, to charts using Google's OAuth. So we can basically take all this custom info This is just Google Analytics API data. It's using chart.js in this example, but you could use any charting library you want. There are 3. There's the Google Polymer bindings, like they're built in Google Charts. There's a version that's like that. This is a third-party charting example. But these are totally custom, and I wrote them with a few hunks. You write your own query, and they're just a few chunks, a few snippets of code for each chart. It uses, you can't see it at the top because it's hidden right now, but it uses Google's own authentication. So my same Google Analytics account has the same orange button at the top. I log in. I'm hosting this on GitHub Pages right now. Any one of you could go to that URL. Where do I have it right now? You can log in. So go to cityanalytics.org. This is sort of in progress. I'm going to launch this so that anybody can use it or fork it or copy it, the reporting piece. /site/sample overview. This is obnoxiously long, I'm sorry. Sample-overview -chart.js -header .html. Obviously not user-friendly right now. But you can log in with your own Google Analytics account. There's no data that's stored locally. And it would only show you in these drop-downs the accounts that you have access to. So once I complete building out some more of these detailed reports, then you would just see the same report I wrote with your own data populated. So if you were to implement this configuration that I'm going to publish, the most beautiful thing about all of this is that all of these little customizations I talked about today, this frustrated user script and tracking video plays, I didn't talk about that, but tracking document downloads with dynamically populated values. One of the things with that PDF download is that instead of sending a URL to whatever the document is, we're actually passing the anchor text as the title of the download, which gives us another clue as to where it came from. So all of those things we can give out now. As of this year, the entire configuration for that container I showed you with all those tags in it can be exported as JSON. And I can give it to you, and you can take it home and deploy it tomorrow. So these are like some of these things I've been working on as tags and customizations for like the last 4 years, as the product has matured and stuff like that. And I can now give it to you for your same use. You know, you have the same use case that I do for the most part. And the nice thing about that is then you can go into the UI and customize it for your own uses. You know, you can. There's also like it's much easier to reverse engineer when you have examples of working tags, right? So the versioning is inherent, and then you can, like I said, debug locally using this. Come here. Oh, I hate that thing. It's because I'm standing here. So these components are actually built into the library. You don't have to build these drop-downs. They grab the information and populate it from Google's API, which is kind of nice, as is this real-time users snippet at the top. Okay, so I want to sum this up in a good way. I'm publishing this configuration on GitHub. It's going to be JSON for now, but in another month or so, I'm actually hoping to have a UI to do this. So you go authenticate via the Google API. You create a Google Tag Manager account if you don't have one. You may have to do that in advance because the APIs don't let you do that. So you go make an account, but it's the same login. So you authenticate to the Google Tag Manager, and then you can literally click a button that says upload this and give me all of the tags that Lauren's built into this container. So roughly, it will look something like this. So you've authenticated already. You can choose your container if, say, for some reason you have 8 million of them. But you could say, I want to track all my document downloads. I want to add video plays and my frustrated users. And then you can upload this configuration and be done with it. And then you just put that snippet everywhere. There's some configuration details, like it's configured not to track anything that's coming from localhost. It's not going to fire your GA tags when you're developing locally on a machine. It keeps it sends these 4 extra custom dimensions to Google Analytics, and you can add cross-domain tracking, which is a kind of a challenge to debug sometimes. So we're talking about having all different domain names rolled up into one Google Analytics account. You'll have problems with your session lengths and stuff that's not referral traffic between those 2 domains. Is going to 2 different domains looks like referral traffic, right? So if I came from Philly Police, which is a real thing, .com, as their official website, and I go to philly.gov, all their traffic, which is significant, looks like referral traffic to me until I deploy this as one roll-up account. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the configuration takes that into account and sets one cookie domain as the default. You can also take any currently existing Google Analytics accounts that you have on the page and roll them into this configuration. So you only have one place that's firing analytics tags. They do not collide. Unlike the normal GA tag snippet, you had to add some extra code to keep the either double reporting or under reporting happening if you had more than one Google Analytics profile firing on a page. That's taken care of in this. I could fire 10 if I really wanted to slam my performance, fire 10 analytics tags on the same page. One of the cooler things is that you can add something that's from the marketing toolkit called Hotjar. And I'll wrap this up in a second, but I didn't want to leave it out. Does anybody know what that is, Hotjar? Hotjar is a user experience tool that basically lets you go in, and it actually is what I showed you in the very beginning. So I can look at user behavior as recorded sessions.
Is it called Hotjar?
Hotjar, yeah. It's actually free to use, and as a government employee, I'm not endorsing any one product over another. But it's free to use. This is a 52-minute session of someone exploring property data. So you can record up to 300 sessions for free, I think. You can do things like up here, you can skip inactivity, right? Because it gets really boring watching somebody like drool over a web page. You can speed it up 4 times, 8 times as fast if you don't want to skip the inactivity.
That's where the cursor was?
Yeah, it's actual cursor activity. We've been trying to figure out what they're doing. When all my developer friends are like, wonder what they're using. Are they actually recording it, with like Phantom.js or something? Which would be like an incredible amount of data for them to be storing. So I think that they're actually rendering the page underneath from the active URL and then superimposing the activity on top of that. So they're not actually hosting all that extra information.
What do you, sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was going to ask what heat maps.
They do heat maps too. They actually do so many things that I can't believe it's all one product. Like I didn't believe it because they are also allowing us to do user feedback in polls, little pop-ups, which can be fired based on rules like regex or strings or.
This is all Hotjar.
This is all Hotjar. So heat maps, we've got some heat maps of our beloved water revenue page. So you can see mobile traffic and it separates it out into these bins. So this is pay my water bill, right? Back to that guy. It shows you where the average fold is on the page, basically across all users. You can separate between clicks, scrolls, and moves, I guess. I don't know, moves, I guess, if it's panning. And then separate out traffic types, mobile, tablet, blah. And then see how those profiles might change on a phone as opposed to a desktop. I'll wrap this up, but this is such a cool thing, I didn't want to leave it out. It can automatically track forms and see where people are abandoning your forms by field. What field is so annoying or useless or confusing? Where do they fall out of that funnel that is a form? And then it has more formal marketing funnels, which you define as the progression between pages that lead to a desired event. So I love to talk about this stuff, and this ended up being a little more dry than I wanted it to, but hopefully it's helpful. My Twitter is somewhere in this thing, and I will tweet when we release the reporting piece and this configuration. It's all on GitHub. And the only reason I'm not doing it right now is because I want to double check it. We've piloted it with a couple of other cities who have tested this. So, are there any questions? I know people have to run. There's a session in here, but I can talk outside if you want. I also, if anybody is really interested in deploying this, would love to host maybe a call in about 2 weeks and kind of walk through it. So,
How do you deal with requests from departments for analytics?
So the sweet thing about building your own reports is that I have now these reusable components, and if they have something specific they want to know, I can make it for them, and it's just based on their own login.
So you do a lot of the work though? It's not like just go to the site and do it yourself?
We're trying to create reusable components that will cover broad use cases so that we're not rebuilding the wheel every time. But one of the last things I'll show you, you can recruit user feedback in line with a pop-up and say, can you do a screen share session with me right now? And the last thing is this guy, which is polls, open-ended polls with free answer questions. This one is targeted only at water because we wanted to see what people's problems were. And the biggest problem was, so I hate word clouds, but this one was actually pretty illustrative. Anyway, thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.